Thank you very much to Dr. Jeremy England, former professor of physics at MIT, and author of Every Life is on Fire. We're always thrilled to have Dr. England back with us at Machon Shilo. Dr. England is currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel. Dr. England.
Thank you very much. So today, as the title of the talk suggests, I want to eventually talk a bit about economics and maybe try to make the case for how I think the Torah views or can be argued to view the significance of free markets, both as an economic tool, but also, how that ties in with a bigger question. And so this is actually aimed at the upcoming Chag of Shavuot, believe it or not, because in a way that might seem a little strange, we're going to try to make the case that there's really a very strong and significant connection that the Torah sees between free markets on the one hand and the revelation that Moshe received at Sinai on the other. But we have to get there step by step. So I think starting with a brief prefatory comment, historically, it is fair to argue, or rather fair to observe, that, let's say, socialism and Marxism and communism, but other versions of all those different species have been popular with Jews. And I don't mean to say, that it's always been a majority of Jews who've liked them, but it's certainly been the case that there have been a lot of very fervent Jewish advocates for various versions of socialism, communism, and Marxism, and also for, let's say, less virulent strains of attitudes about political economy that see a big role for governments and redistributing wealth and controlling or regulating economic activity. And I think that there's a lot of historical reasons for that, and we don't have to go deep into it right now because that's a whole discussion and much more discussion about the history of the Jewish people than anything else. But I think sometimes it is treated like, to the degree that Jews have those leanings, it's because they're learning it from various aspects of the mitzvot of the Torah that people sometimes refer to as social justice. Now, I'm not a big fan of the term social justice. I think if you look at the history of how that term arose, for example, as a popular one in America, it was actually in the early 20th century pretty strongly linked to American Catholic anti-Semitism, and so it's kind of an irony and a disappointment that that's become a banner that often is raised in the context of discussions in Jewish societies and elsewhere. But I think that we don't have to delve all into that history right now. But I think that the short way of making the point is just that maybe some would like to argue that there are various mitzvot in the Torah we can discuss in a second that look sort of like they are about taking wealth that is in the hands of those who more directly produced it and redistributing it to people who are what you would call the have-nots. And that, in broad strokes, is kind of what we are thinking about when we're talking about socialism and other kinds of redistributive, more left-leaning theories of how political economy is supposed to work. But I really think it probably runs in the opposite direction, meaning that there are many historical reasons and cultural reasons that Marxism and a sort of broad band of different political leanings, not going that far to the left, but sort of drawn by that pole, have been popular with Jews. And since they've been popular with Jews, there's been sort of an industry for a very long time of trying to, I would argue, somewhat disingenuously take the Torah and say, well, we want the answer to be Marxism, or we want the answer to be something maybe not quite as extreme as Marxism. And so we're going to go digging around in the Torah and in Tanakh and try to sort of hold up different pieces of it and say, look, this is basically saying that this is what we should be doing. And so really this is coming from the Torah. But I think it has to be argued in detail that why these readings are a bit disingenuous. But if you'll accept for a moment the premise that I'm going to run with here, I I don't think that we learn Marxism or socialism or things like that from the Torah. I think, in fact, the Torah is very careful in how it deals with issues of economic redistribution, so that on the one hand, it shows sensitivity to the persistent problem of inequality of wealth and access to different kinds of wealth, money or food or livestock or land, or these basic things that the economy that the Torah imagines is always concerned with. So it's aware of the existence of poverty, explicitly states that poverty shall never vanish from the land. And then there are obviously many mitzvot that do exist that look to some degree like, if you're not looking too closely, you could call them, let's say, government or legal or state or regulatory intervention in economic transactions that try to redistribute wealth. But I think if you look at many such examples, they really don't have the same flavor as what becomes, let's say, 20th century versions of socialism or communism, Marxism, whatever, left-leaning liberal redistributionism, for a variety of reasons. Many of them, for example, are not about taking wealth that is in the pocket of someone, so to speak, and putting it in someone else's pocket, but it's rather about preventing someone from taking pains to avoid some of their unharvested wealth ending up in the hands of others. So we have the mitzvah of peah, for example, that the corners of your agricultural plot are not to be harvested so that they may be gathered by the poor. But the point is, until you harvest it, you may own the land, but the fruit is not actually in your hands, so to speak. So you're leaving it there for someone else to harvest it, but you're not harvesting it and then taking out of it. Now, we can talk about tithing in a second also, and obviously, so there are also mitzvot involving tithing where you take from things that you've already picked. But peah is not that, right? There's another mitzvah about, you're transporting your produce and it falls off of your method of transportation. You can't put it back on, right? So you're not, again, being told you have to dump 10% of your produce on the ground while you're driving or something, but if something falls off, you can't go after it. So there's this element of happenstance, or it slipped through your fingers and you can't sort of go back and grab it. Or when you're picking your trees, you can't beat the trees to make sure that every single piece of fruit falls down, and that it all goes to you, therefore, because it's being gathered by your workers. So mitzvot like these, I think they show the subtlety of the Torah and how it deals with these issues, because it's, on the one hand, saying, look, there are people who are poor, who may not have land themselves, who are going to starve unless they have food, and you need to participate in various processes that will make it more likely that they survive, because they're also part of your nation and they're your people. On the other hand, this is being done in a way that tries as much as possible to let it be about the happenstance or about the refusal of the owner of the produce to go to extra effort to gather every last bit for himself. And that is different than saying, well, once you've gathered your wealth together, it doesn't belong to you. And really, it sort of all belongs to the powers that be to decide who gets it. Because the extreme communist vision, obviously, is that all the produce of the land belongs to the government, and then the government will make the best decisions about who gets what. And that certainly is not in the vision of the Torah if you go mitzvah by mitzvah. And there, you can keep on multiplying examples like this. If you look at Shemitah, we're in the year of Shemitah, for example, right now. And so this, I think, is more along the lines of also what one should say about tithing. There are cases where they sound, again, a bit more radically like what you think of as systems of redistribution that may have been advocated by Marxist revolutionaries at some point, because in the year of Shemitah, if you're a landowner, your land produces fruit, and you're not allowed to operate as a business person trying to make the land more productive so that you can sell the fruit and make money. So there is a sense in which, like, for a year, the land just belongs to everyone, and anyone who wants to is supposed to be able to just walk around and pick the fruit and take what they like. And so you get these temporary moments where this radical utopian vision is realized. But there's this also acknowledgement that the world can't actually work this way. It doesn't work to have this be the case all the time. So you have these Shabbatot, these years every 7 years, where you alter the way you operate, and you sort of pretend for a moment that property ownership is a bit weaker as a concept, and the people can just walk around and pick fruits from whatever field they want. But you put that in a rhythm with 6 years where people are trying to make the land productive, and there's this acknowledgement that that's very important, and it has to operate that way. And I think tithing also is like this, because it goes according to a schedule, right? That in different years, you're making your maserot differently, right? So in some years, the maserot in principle are going to the poor, and in other years, there are maserot that are going. If you're talking about, maser rishon, maser sheni, I don't want to get into all the different halachot of this right now, but there are different tithes that you make from your produce. They go in different directions, but from one year to the next, where they go, like what they're meant to go towards, will change, and it isn't always to the same degree redistributive towards those who have less. And also, it must be acknowledged that a huge part of the redistribution is not the maserot, but trumot, right? The redistribution to the kehuna, to this hereditary class of people who don't own land. So on the one hand, they kind of are land poor, but on the other hand, they might become wealthy, dwelling in the cities and engaging in other activities, and you're still giving them fruits of your produce because they're kohanim, and they in principle are serving in the mikdash and things like that. So when you look at the system as a whole, there is redistribution, and some of it is, there is obligatory redistribution. Some of it you wouldn't quite say is downward from the wealthy to the not wealthy. And it is in any case also not redistribution in an arbitrary sort, but redistribution of foods, which then only certain people can eat. So it's really not to be thought of as being something simple like taking a portion of one person's wealth and giving it to another. And then you also have some redistribution that goes from tithing, but that's a portion among all sorts of other kinds of portions that are going in different directions that have other purposes. So I think that it must be acknowledged, if you take the mitzvot of the Torah as a whole, you see a system that is trying to have an impact on how the produce of the land and other kinds of wealth flow around and go from one place to another. But it is exceedingly difficult to say that, if we just want to summarize this, the Torah is in favor of forced redistribution of all kinds of wealth from those who have to those who don't. And so, in this modern and enlightened society where we don't think in those terms anymore, we should just let Leon Trotsky decide who gets what, right? That is not remotely a sincere way of reading the mitzvot of the Torah. And I think to the degree that people try to say, oh yeah, the Torah is for social justice, the Torah, believes in maybe a socialistically leaning regime of forced redistribution of wealth, that is in the hands or on the lips of many Jewish readers, I would say, an insincere reading that really comes from a historically driven place where you have a lot of historic cultural love of socialism that causes people to be looking for reasons to support that view that don't have a lot of support if you are really trying to be faithful to the text. So that's a prefatory remark. Why is that an important remark to make? Well, I think that's the reason I wanted to start with there is because while what I said may be the case, I don't think that in the Torah itself, people would usually say that they think that there's much of a commentary on, let's say, the opposite direction of, if you were trying to justify more of a libertarian view and say, no, the government should be weak and should just be concerned mostly with national defense, and then otherwise you should let people do what they want and freely transact, and these kind of ideas that they certainly have their adherents and are popular today in certain circles. There may be those who would try to argue from some things that they lift out of the Talmud, that this is somehow coherent with or consonant with the vision of the Talmudic sages. But probably most people would say, I don't really, other than the fact that the Torah seems to leave a lot of things unregulated by its own mitzvot or its own laws, it may seem mostly silent on the question of the difference between a socialist society and let's say a more libertarian society. And so while we might be able to say that the attempts at sort of shoehorning radical socialism into a reading of the Torah where it doesn't actually fit are not well intended or not really going to be successful for those trying to give faithful reading of the text, it seems also like the libertarian sort of reading is absent or there isn't much to say about it. So I'm not going to try to argue to you that libertarianism is actually what the Torah is trying to teach, because I think what the Torah is trying to teach is the Torah. And the Torah is wonderfully balanced and subtle and complex in that way. And it doesn't give you simple idols. It tries to guide you away from them, which means that whenever you try to sum it up in a simpler principle, no matter what you're going to find, it comes down on either side of that principle in some cases, and that you have to study them and see how they all fit together. But that being said, I do think that there is an underappreciated discourse on free markets and the power and the potential that they have that we can unearth here, and it can be interesting. And I think it's also connected specifically with the idea of Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah at Sinai. So this is what I want to kind of lay out now by trying to understand a little bit better who were the Midianites, who was Midian, as we see in the first source here, a son of Avraham Avinu, but who also were the tribe that descended from Midian, and what kind of a role really were they playing in the life and times of Moshe Rabbeinu? Right, Moshe gave us the Torah. He led us out of Egypt, all not in that order, but there's also early and later in his life some things that involve Midian, and they seem enough like they're just part of the backstory that we may not notice when and why they appear. But if you sum it all up, I think it does add up to some significant points with respect to this discussion of political economy that we started off with. So first of all, Midian was a son of Avraham Avinu, right? And we're told that. We're also told that at the end of Avraham's life, he parts ways with his various children, and he gives them gifts, matanot. Rashi's commentary on this is that the matanot were he taught them magic, which is, it sounds like a curious comment. We maybe can go back to that in due course, because I think that there is a way of reading that doesn't sound like just a strange side note that has disturbing undertones. Magic is supposed to be something that we're not supposed to be dealing in according to the Torah. But in any case, we don't hear much about the people who are descended from Avraham in this list of this genealogy from Torah. But then later on in the life of Moshe, we obviously re-encounter Midian at the time. Well, this is not the first time we encounter Midian, but it's the time I want to start off with. So we re-encounter Midian at the time when Moshe is running away from Mitzrayim, and he comes to Midian. We know the story. He saves the daughters of Yitro from the shepherds at the well, and then he's invited to dwell with them. He marries Tzipporah, who's the daughter of the priest of Midian, and then he stays with them for a long time, and that really becomes the basis for his first encounter with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Har Chorev, which is Har Sinai, right? So we view this as maybe just a detail. He had to be somewhere when he first encountered Hashem, so it may as well have been with Midian. The point of Midian is just it was a place where he could find safe haven when he ran away from Mitzrayim. And we already should be noticing here that Midian is a relative of his, right? The Midianim are not the most strange and alien people that he could have encountered. He found descendants of Avraham Avinu, and he found a good place for himself there. So he is reconnecting with something that comes from Avraham. And that already should make us, that should enliven us to the possibility that there is a reason that Midian is the place that he encounters HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the first time. That it may be that there were some fires that Midian kept burning from Avraham that had actually, to some degree, perhaps gone out amongst the Ivrim in Mitzrayim, and Moshe is kind of relearning something that he can bring back to the people. And that's especially a point worth chewing on, because it is both the case that Moshe has his first encounter with HaKadosh Baruch Hu when he is tending the flock of Yitro in Midian, but also that when Matan Torah is going to happen at Har Sinai, that begins with a new encounter with Yitro, right? Parshat Yitro is the portion of the Torah where we talk about the giving of the Torah. And so Moshe has led the people out of Mitzrayim after being sent there, but he doesn't go to a different place. I mean, obviously, HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have revealed himself wherever he wanted, and it didn't have to be the case that Moshe brought the people back to Sinai, back to Har Chorev, where he had this first encounter. But there are many reasons it might be important that he actually is doing that. But the point is, when he's doing that, the Midianim, who you might have wondered, they might be nomadic shepherds. They were in Chorev the first time, but maybe they're somewhere else. This, many years later, when Moshe brings Bnei Yisrael out of Mitzrayim, but no, he brings Bnei Yisrael out of Mitzrayim, and he is now. Sorry, I shouldn't say many years later, but he brings Bnei Yisrael out of Mitzrayim enough time later that nomadic shepherds could have moved to somewhere else, and the Midianim are still there. It seems like Har Sinai or Har Chorev, this place where Moshe encountered HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is to a significant degree their domain somehow. Like it's their area, at least temporarily, at least during this generation or in this era. And so we should be asking already, what is it about the Midianim that enables the revelation of Sinai? Because at this point, more than one hit here with Yitro. Moshe does stuff with Yitro, and then you get contact with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and really dramatic revelations on this mountain of God. So if that's the case, then why is Yitro somehow the gatekeeper of that? What is it that he enables? What does Midian represent that makes that possible? And as I said, you could just say, maybe this is, some kind of deep knowledge that Avraham Avinu achieved as a Navi, which was maintained through his descendants in Midian, and actually might have been less accessible amongst the Ivrim, who were downtrodden for centuries, being worked as slaves in Mitzrayim. And so Moshe, in this strange way, had to reconnect with the real deal, Avraham, through this distant cousin. And eventually those distant cousins are going to go off the rails in their own way, and they have a different kind of relationship to Hashem that is somehow less durable, but it still could be the case that this is rekindled as a result of that contact. But I think we should dig a little deeper, because we know some other things about Midian that may help us to even understand why they were, of all the descendants of Avraham, the ones that facilitated this, right? Because that's the other thing you still have to ask. So Avraham had lots of descendants. Kadosh Baruch Hu says that he's going to make him into many nations, and he does. So there's the Yishmaelim, and there's the Adumim, or let's say the ones who are descended from Esav. There's the Amalekim, which is not fun to remind ourselves of, but Amalek also comes from Abraham, because Amalek was the grandchild of Esav. And so you really have a lot of different nations that are, milling around here that come from Abraham in one way or another. So why is Midian the catalyst for this transformative event in the life of Am Yisrael? So I think that we can start to understand this if we try to develop a theory of what Midian is by looking at some other sources that come earlier. So first of all, there's this famous moment when the brothers, the sons of Yaakov and the brothers of Yosef, sell him down to Mitzrayim. This is now much earlier, right? It's hundreds of years earlier than when Moshe is in Mitzrayim. And we have this moment where there's this confusing discussion of who is doing what that we kind of gloss over because it's sort of hard to resolve, and there are different mefarshim who make different interpretations. But basically, the brothers at first they look up. So vayishvu lecholechem vayisu einehem ויראו והנה אורחת ישמעאלים באה מגלעד, וגמליהם נושאים נכות וצרי ולות, הולכים להוריד מצרים. So they sat down to a meal, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelim coming from Gilad, and their camels were bearing gum and balm and laudanum to be taken to Mitzrayim. So at first it seems like, okay, it's the Ishmaelim. They're the ones who are going to take Yosef to Mitzrayim. And then that is confirmed when we go further down, and Yehuda says, let's sell him to the Ishmaelim, right? ונמכרנו לישמעאלים. לכו ונמכרנו לישמעאלים. So let's go sell him to the Ishmaelim. And then out of nowhere, in a way that it's hard initially to make sense of, we come down a little further and it says, ויעברו אנשים מדיינים סוחרים וימשכו ויעלו את יוסף מן הבור וימכרו את יוסף לישמעאלים ב-20 כסף ויביאו את Yosef Mitzrayim. So the Midyanim traders passed by and they pull Yosef up out of the pit and they sold him to, someone sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelim who brought Yosef to Mitzrayim. So the Midyanim come out of nowhere and they sort of tack onto something that's already seemingly happening where they're thinking they want to sell to the Ishmaelim. And it's sort of, where do they come from and what are they doing here? Why are they part of the story at all? Aside from the fact that, of course, this is like a who's who of descendants of Avraham Avinu, as we mentioned, right? Ishmael was the son of Abraham. Midian was the son of Abraham. So two different sons of Abraham who are not in the line of Yaakov are coming along to facilitate this tragedy in the life of Yaakov. There's other things, obviously, there we could read into that. But in any case, we're being told already about this connection to Abraham again, implicitly by the text. But why did the Midyanim have to be added on? And the first thing, before I actually go into the theory of who the Midyanim are, I want to just point out that this happens more than once, where the Midyanim are just kind of these fellow travelers that appear when they seemingly don't need to. So, for example, the initial tragedy in Sefer Bamidbar that is triggered by Bil'am ben Beor when he's trying to tempt Bnei Israel into idolatry seems to be about the women of Moab. Vayeshev Yisrael b'shitim, vayahel ha'am liznot el benot Moab. Okay, so they're getting involved with the women of Moab, and that's a problem. But somehow, when this event culminates and Pinchas is about to impale some people and all of that, it's an Isha Midyanit. It's a Midianite woman who is the one who is consorting with this prince of the tribe of Shimon. What is his name? Cosby, but maybe it's not listed in this pasuk, so I'm gonna miss her name. Maybe she is the daughter of Cosby, or her name is Cosby. I'm not remembering, but it says that it says V'hine ish mibnei Yisrael ba v'yakrev el ehav et hamidyanit la'enei Moshe or la'enei kol adat bnei Yisrael v'hemel bochim petach ohel mo'ed. So you have a certain Israelite man came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companion. So why is there a Midianite woman here at all? I mean, we kind of know that actually, because narratively, this tacking on has already happened, right? This is from a sequence of events further up here. Maybe actually, did I not? I think maybe I didn't get to add the source, but this is really coming from an earlier event where Bilam is being enlisted by Balak, Melech Moab, right? The king of Moab. So Balak is Melech Moab, and he wants to curse Bnei Israel. And so he wants Bilam to be the one to curse Israel. And of course, for some reason that involves Ziknei Midian, right? So even though Melech Moab, the king of Moab, is the one who's trying to do it, the story without explanation adds in Ziknei Midian as being the ones who are going to Bilam and trying to get him to curse Bnei Israel. So I'm sorry I missed that source here, but that's maybe a reason why later on we don't wonder why there's a Midianite woman here hanging around here when it was initially seemingly the daughters of Moab that they were getting involved with. But that's the question over and over and over again, is why did Midian need to be here, first of all? Because it already seemed like a set of events that was going on without them. And also, what is it about Midian that makes them play that role? Like, can we learn anything about who the Midianim are themselves that will somehow suggest to us, what their role is, such that they can, always be there at these moments, and they have something extra to add. So I think that the real hint really goes back to this first source about them, in the selling of Yosef, because they're not just described as Midyanim. They're described as Anashim Midyanim Soharim, right? They are Midianite traders. Soharim means traders. And we shouldn't just gloss over this or glide by it. Soharim is something we could even look elsewhere in Tanakh for another proof text to help explain to us a little bit more exactly what it means to be a trader, right? Because if you heard the Yishmaelim, they're transporting spices or incense or whatever down to Mitzrayim, so they are also traders, right? They're involved in trade. They're carrying goods from one place to another. So what makes them just Yishmaelim, but the Midyanim are Midyanim Soharim? What's the difference, right? Why are they not both Soharim in this passage? And I think that you get that from Eshet Chayil, right? This very famously read over and over again, near full chapter of Proverbs or of Mishlei, that is the beginning of Kiddush on Friday nights for many people who are making Kiddush Erev Shabbat. So we have Hayta ki aniyat soher mimerhak tavi lahma. So she is like a merchant fleet bringing her food from afar, and that I think is the key point. This idea of what it is that the traders are doing here. If you take this comparison, this pasuk, this verse, what it's referring to, the idea of a sohar or soher here, aniyot soher are boats that bring things from afar, in order to facilitate transactions, right? So the Midyanim are likened to seafaring peoples, let's say, in the Mediterranean, maybe the Phoenicians, the Greeks, whatever, the people from Tyre, from Tor, who are referred to in Tanakh a lot, for example, who are generating wealth by being the ones who enable trade from one party to another. And the Midyanim are obviously not seafarers. They're in a desert, and they're not going around in boats, but they are playing the role of facilitating transactions. And I think what especially this source with the Yishmaelim is really demonstrating to us in light of this, in comparison to the idea of Aniyot Soher, is that they are dafka not the ones with the mechanism of transportation, right? We're told that what makes someone a soher is that they are somehow facilitating transaction over distance, like that they are enabling one party to transact with another party. But the Yishmaelim are the ones here who have the camels. That's explicitly mentioned. The Yishmaelim have the camels. So the Yishmaelim you can think of as the truckers, right? And then what does that make the Midyanim? What role are they playing? The role the Midyanim have to be playing is that they are somehow the brokers of the transaction. They're the ones who enable trade between different places. They're actually playing a role that in some ways we think of historically as being a very important role played by Jews among other peoples, not exclusively by Jews, but at many times in history in many places played by Jews because, for example, maybe they had a common language, systems of communication, some kind of basis of trust between parties who were in different places, so that they could do things like draw up contracts, they could do things like weigh out sums of money, they could do things like stay where the transaction was happening and help all the parties involved feel that the transaction that's happening is fair and is happening according to the rules that were set down. Because if you don't have that, then it's very hard to transact a lot of the time. And we take that for granted. Most people who are using Zoom presumably live in societies where there's a fair amount of stability and reliability in things like the enforcement of contracts, in things like the obedience to laws governing transactions, mechanisms for counting money, all the things that we think of, as lawyers and accountants doing. And I think that it is sometimes thought of as those middlemen who play these roles, that they're sort of these parasites who are, and this is obviously part of an anti-Semitic stereotype when Jews very often in different places have played this role. They're parasites because the transaction is, just between party A and party B, and they would just love to get together and do what they want. But somehow, because of all the corruption in the society, you have all these middlemen who are there to sort of siphon off some of the wealth and keep it for themselves. Now, that's an inaccurate and sometimes anti-Semitic, or sometimes simply inaccurate anti-lawyer, anti-accountant kind of stereotype. But people who understand how markets actually work, what they understand is that people who make markets, they are able to earn a lot of wealth for themselves because they're creating tremendous value by taking a world in which transactions weren't possible and turning it into a world where they are possible, right? Because the value of my wealth and the value of your wealth is pebbles if you and I can't trade, if we can't trust each other. If I think I'm going to come to you and we're going to try to make some agreement about, I give you a goat for this and you give me a pile of barley or whatever for that, but I think the moment I turn around, you're going to bash my head in with a rock, then the amount of value that can be created through commerce is very limited. And it's not just about, obviously, violence, it's also about trust in the accuracy of statements that are being made and of terms that are being set and of quantities of things that are being provided, right? Scales, the measuring of scales, the measuring of quantities of items with scales. A lot of things that we take for granted, you can imagine a world where you don't have these things and where it's hard for someone to even tell whether they're getting the deal that they were told or whether that deal is what was told or whether everyone is misremembering what it was. And so when you add up all the different things, all these ingredients, writing, the measurement of quantities of things in a reliable way, trustworthy ombudsman or sort of third parties that can look at what each party in the transaction is doing and say everything is okay, and everyone is happy with that, and they walk away non-violently and happy with how they made out. That kind of market making is a tremendous value creation for all the parties who are going to be involved. And so it's both the case that you could say that the people who create such markets really deserve a lot of the wealth that they earn from doing so, because it wouldn't exist without them. And also that the world goes around in a sense when you're able to actually create these conditions and ensure them stably. And this is what I want to argue that the Midyanim are doing. And it starts to become plausible that maybe this is what they learned from Abraham. Maybe these were the matanot, that this is the magic, so to speak, a way of doing things that others don't understand that seems inscrutable, but somehow blesses everything and makes things succeed and go well, right? That when you teach systems of writing, how to count things, methods of measurement, and methods of contract law, and you also establish a morality between people that allows people to trust each other and to not feel like they're constantly being tricked and lied to in the manner, perhaps, let's say, of the Yishmanim, who are in the understanding and worldview of the Torah, maybe more likely to be ones to watch for that kind of behavior. When you can establish this kind of a set of conditions, you enable transactions that couldn't happen and you create value. And we haven't linked this all the way back to Matan Torah yet, although you may see where I'm going with this. But I just want to say that there's a proof in the Torah itself for this point, that if we really want, we can look for a source in Chumash that comes very early on in the life of Avraham that shows us how difficult transactions are when you don't have Midyanim, right? Because there's this moment where Abimelech from the Plishtim comes with the chief of his troops for some reasons, and so that's an interesting addition that we usually just waltz right over. Avimelech ufichol sar tzavao, he comes with the head of his army, and that gives the shadow of potential violence already. And he goes to Avraham and he says, basically, I am impressed by you. I think God is with you. And this is after Avraham has been successful in war and really has shown the people of Canaan that he's there to stay and that he really has to be reckoned with and that he's very blessed. So now Avimelech wants to make a brit, a covenant with him. And there already is, in this passage, mentioned an instance where Avimelech has not been dealing so well with Avraham. Avraham says, okay, I will make a covenant with you, but what about this affair that happened between our shepherds where, I was not, and my people were not treated properly? And of course, Avimelech says, oh, I don't know who did this, and you didn't tell me about it, and I haven't heard of it until today, and all of this, I had no idea, right? So it's showing you the precondition where you don't have reliable facilitation of transactions and all the components of that are required, where you need a trusted, impartial source of security, you need accounting, you need lawyers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, like all those organs of a functioning society. They didn't have all of that. And so Avimelech could just try to act like a gangster and afterwards say, oh, I had no idea. It had nothing to do with me, right? So he's probably not to be trusted. But so Avraham wants to give Avimelech the chance to sort of reach in his direction and make an agreement with him and perhaps be less of a criminal going forward. And what do they have? They have this problem of how do they authenticate their brit, their covenant? And the way that they do that is with sheep, with these 7 ewes, these 7 kifsot, these female sheep. So Sheva kifsot hatzon livad hen. So he set apart these 7 ewes and he says, these are supposed to be the proof that I dug this well that they were arguing over. So the name of the place will be Beersheba because of this oath or because of the 7 ewes. But the key point I want to make here is that this passage is directly referent to Moshe's first encounter with Midian. Why? Well, we have shepherds who are doing kind of violent and unfair treatment of each other. We have also the idea of sheep in connection with shepherds. We have 7 females, right? In this case, they're female sheep instead of the 7 daughters of Midian that we had at the beginning of this whole discussion. And we also have a well, a bear, like the well where Moshe was saving the daughters of Yitro. And on top of everything, the guy that Avraham is dealing with here is named Avimelech. So, Avimelech is like my father is the king, right? So these daughters, their father was in charge of Midian, right? He's the Kohen of Midian. He's the leader of Midian from everything that we can tell from the Torah. So you have all these different themes in this passage that are pointing directly at Moshe's first encounter with Midian. And I think the reason is because it's about this issue of transaction. It's saying, look at how hard this is just for 2 people who don't want to kill each other necessarily, to trust each other enough to make an agreement. And they're trying to invent a means of doing that, saying like, look, I'll give you these sheep. And then whenever anyone sees these sheep and you say, where'd you get those sheep? They'll know, and because I'll put the word out, those represent the fact that you sold this well to me, because otherwise you could say, all right, I'll sell the well to you. And then tomorrow you could try to kill me, or you could deny that you sold it to me and you have my money. And now you can still act like a gangster. So Midian represents an attempt to, in a world that's mostly in this state of nature where a lot of this ill treatment of people is still going on, to be kind of a ambulatory unit that can make transactions happen between people who don't by default necessarily trust each other and where they're not really governed by a lot of laws. And now that, in one respect, sounds like a great thing, right? And it sounds like a thing that it's legitimate to imagine would be something we learned from Avraham Avinu, that it's part of his positive impact on the world, that he didn't just give birth, or he didn't give birth, but he didn't just father Yitzchak Avinu and give rise to the line that would produce Bnei Israel. That's the ultimate, the ultimate project that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has initiated with Abraham for transforming the world. But already through the other nations that Abraham is putting out in the world, he's perhaps having what you would call, speaking loosely, a positive impact, because the Midyanim are bringing into the world things that maybe, all things being equal, we say, that the world was better off having. And it maybe even is written into their name, right? Midyan, if you break it apart, on either side with the letters that the letters that are often just grammatical particles that attach to things in Hebrew, you have really like the Dalit in the Yud inside, or maybe the Mem Dalit, or maybe the Dalit Yud Nun. And so it sort of breaks apart in different ways. It either could be that Midyan is about Din, right? Dayan is judge. So it's about the idea of law and judgment on the one hand, or to measure things also is about this Mem Dalit word, right? So Lo tasu awel b'mishpat b'midah b'mishkal uva mesura. So this is a mitzvah in the Torah. You shouldn't falsify measures of length, weight, or capacity. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu commands us in the Torah itself that we have fair measures, and in the word for fair measures is the word midah. So midyan is also about measurement. So one way or another, I think we want to argue that Avraham Avinu is having his impact on the world in many ways. One of the ways is that one of his sons, Midyan, becomes this nation that is spreading the word about rule of law and fair partnership in agreements, fair honesty in transactions, and all of the sort of elements that are needed for that. So maybe sort of police and lawyers and accountants and whatever other, negotiators, people who go between parties and facilitate fair transactions so that people can enrich themselves and the world and do so peacefully and with trust. That's what Midyan represents. And once you talk about Midyan that way, it starts to sound like, wow, maybe that is something big enough, something transformative enough, something profound enough, something closely enough connected to the deepest roots of what the Torah is, that we could believe that Midyan would be the people that would bring Moshe Rabbeinu to Har Sinai and that would connect him to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because in the present day, where we take the existing societies that benefit so much from fair facilitation of transactions, but we take that so much for granted, one thinks about lawyers or accountants or police or whatever, each in isolation as sort of, one element that's there, and if you took it away, it wouldn't necessarily immediately all come crashing down, and they're all just kind of helping people to do what they intend to do anyway. But the reality is that until you make a society or until you make a market, none of that can work. None of that happens. There's no such thing as free markets without creating the conditions in which they can operate. And when you think about all of those different elements, what they're really about, it's about law. It's not just about law, it's also about honesty, right? And fairness and truthfulness. And it's about objective measurement of reality even, right? It's about the idea that there's such a thing as a scale, and if you design the scale correctly, then it's a fair scale and you're actually apportioning known quantities. And so it's also even about, in a sense, about science. It's about the objective measurable aspects of reality that are equally available to all people if they start developing shared procedures of measurement. So when you start pointing out law on the one hand as a thing governing transactions between people, and on the other hand, writing, and on the other hand, enforcement of law, by police, and on the other hand, even perhaps natural science through the objective measurement of quantities of things, and this connection with scales and other kinds of quantification, that sounds like a really big deal. That sounds like a worldview that comes in a tempting way very close to just being what the Torah is trying to teach us about in perhaps all or close to all of its aspects. And so maybe it's not so implausible that when we go back over here, we now remind ourselves that it was a priest of Midyan who brought Moshe to Har Sinai or Har Chorev originally, and it was that same priest of Midyan who was there again to facilitate the national revelation that was Matan Torah, where we were given the Luchot Brit and the Torah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu intended for us at Har Sinai. It may be that Midian was, in some sense, also a facilitator of that transaction, right? Because they afterwards step back and are not there anymore. Eventually, Yitro goes his own way, perhaps, or maybe he stays, but the Midianim go their own way, and eventually we certainly end up in a war with Midian. But Midian doesn't remain simply the same thing as Bnei Yisrael, but in this moment, it's like they're facilitating a transaction between Bnei Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and even playing the role in that sense. And we can believe it because once we conceive of Midian this way, we realize that ensuring the functioning of free markets and all the different elements that are necessary for that may be so close to foundational of the Torah as a whole that it's believable that Midian could be the ones who make the revelation of the Torah possible, even if they themselves are not the people to whom the Torah is ultimately going to be revealed. So in closing, there's a final point, which is, now the question is, why isn't Midian the people to which the Torah is revealed? And how are we to square all of this with the fact that the Midianim ultimately go a way that the Torah views as being maximally problematic, right? This closing source here is Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, Nekom nikmat bnei Yisrael me'et hamidyanim har te'asef el amecha. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, avenge the Israelite people on the Midianim, and then you shall be gathered to your kin. Meaning Moshe is about to die. In his last act, before he dies, basically, it's supposed to be that he has to exterminate the people of Midian. And he even is angry when the Israelites come back and haven't killed the women. He says, no, you should have also killed the women who participated in this whole matter with Baal Peor and Bilam and everything else. So this is a very far distance for the Midianim to fall in our estimation, because we were just saying it's almost like they knew the Torah already and they taught it to Moshe, and then Moshe was just kind of passing it along to us, and maybe they kind of had it already from Avraham Avinu, and all these things that make them sound like they're our older brother who taught us everything we know, and so they must have an even purer Torah in some sense than we do. But that's not the case. And why is that not the case? What's the problem? I think the problem is illustrated very neatly in the sources we've already looked at, right? If we say what the Midianim are these people who are all about accuracy in measurement and all about doing things according to the law, making a safe place for people to transact, enforcement of contracts, accountants, policemen, lawyers, whatever you need for that kind of stuff, there's still the question of what the law is, right? And there's still also the question of, are there transactions that it can be the case that A wants to be a party to peacefully and B wants to be a party to peacefully, but they're still not ones that you should facilitate, that the market should allow, right? That the liberty of this condition in this free market that has been created shouldn't be letting happen if it were really trying to do things the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. And that I think we see roundly in the examples we've actually presented, because what are the different things that the Midianim actually do now? So we hear about the positive thing, right? The positive transaction is that they are the ombudsman or facilitator for the transaction between Bnei Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's very much in their favor. But what else are they facilitators of? They also are facilitators of this transaction where Yosef is being sold by his brothers. Is being sold by his brothers. So the Ishmaelim perhaps could not have on their own transacted with the brothers. The Midianim step in and they say, hey, we can make a buck here by just helping. We're going to lift him out of the pit, and we're going to talk to these guys over here and talk to those guys over there, and then we'll make a deal happen. Everyone's happy, except of course, Yosef, right? Yosef is being sold into slavery. So the sale of a human being as a kidnapped slave is something maybe a free market could imagine accepting and supporting, right? Depending on what the laws are. And I think any libertarian who tells you, oh, well, but that's just, naturally there always are going to be laws against things that you just can't do. Well, which are those things? And do we actually come up with that automatically, or is that something we need, in a sense, revealed on tablets, right? We need some system that has divine inspiration to help us have the confidence to say, no, this we don't do. That's called lo tignov, like don't kidnap and sell someone in slavery. That is an offense punishable by death. It's totally forbidden. It's one of the 10 commandments, right? But it seems that the Midyanim are willing to be facilitators for such a transaction. Then we go over to Bilam and Balak, and I didn't end up retaining the sources for the beginning of that, but this thing with the Moabite women is the tail end of a story where Balak is saying, okay, I want to hire a sorcerer to curse Bnei Israel and destroy them. And, we can talk more about what it means that he's cursing them, but the point is, you could say for the moment, it's about, let's say, hiring a consultant. Like there's another nation. You are made uncomfortable by that nation. You would like to hire a consultant to be someone who can explain to you how to eliminate them. And that is also something, perhaps, that the Midyanim could facilitate, right? They're not initially the ones who are trying to do violence against Bnei Israel or anything. They're just there to facilitate a transaction where the king of Moab wants to eliminate Bnei Israel, and he wants a consultant to help him figure out how to do that. And the Midyanim will be there to make a bit of money and help people to peacefully deal with each other. But what are they trying to do? They're trying to destroy Am Hashem, the people of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that also is something HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not in favor of. And so it becomes this comical farce where the consultant can't say anything that is useful to Balak initially, although Bilam ultimately pulls a short-term victory out of the fire for himself by arranging this thing with the Benot Moab and Benot Midian. So ultimately, that's why we round up here. At the ending of this period in life of Moshe, right? Moshe is created as the Navi who has direct connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and brings the people out of Mitzrayim in order to inherit the mantle of Avraham and receive the Torah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu at Har Sinai. Moshe, is doing all that because the Midyanim are creating him as that figure to a significant degree, and he is totally bound up in that. He's married to a Midianite woman. And how does that chapter end? That chapter ends with these Midyanim or their descendants or some other nation called Midian that stands for the same idea have now gone against us and against HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because it turns out that being all about free markets and facilitation of transactions sometimes puts you on the wrong side. And then even Moshe will have to eliminate and fight against and make war against the representatives who are standing for the facilitation of evil. And so what I think ultimately can take out of this is something that I hope is sufficiently balanced and subtle. In a way, by contrast, many attempts at, as I mentioned before, shoehorning radical socialism into the words of the Torah is not going to be. What we have on the one hand is the idea that free markets and their facilitation, that's not a sideshow. That may be a fundamental and central idea to what the Torah is trying to teach us about, that we can bring to the world. Because ultimately, this is about human freedom, right? It's about cherut. It's about once you have laws given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu and you can live freely according to them, then you do want markets to be able to function and people to be able to make choices about how to transact. And all the bracha that comes from that freedom is coming in a sense of the logic or the wisdom or the chokhmah of all of this, in part from all the wealth that's created by free markets and by free transaction. So there is a very strong libertarian strain that's running through all of this in what the Torah is trying to show. It's trying to show us that you don't want a heavy hand interfering and telling people what they can and can't do. What you want to do is facilitate and then leave free people to figure out what to do together. But on the other hand, of course, if you simply say that, and you simply advocate for radical libertarianism, then the problem you're going to have is that people won't make the right choices all the time. And sometimes the transactions that they'll be facilitating and benefiting from and generating wealth from will be ones that are abhorrent and that the Torah will roundly reject. So we owe, in one sense, our birth as a nation and our Torah to an idea of freedom that embraces and includes economic freedom. And in a sense, this is a no-brainer, right? Liberation from slavery is about also the realization of economic freedom. And it is notable, for example, that Bnei Yisrael, in the final Makkah, the final blow against Paro, where they leave Mitzrayim, it's a dispute about private property. Paro says you can take everything except your livestock. And the people say, no, we need our livestock because we need to use our livestock to serve Hashem. And private property is part of the equation here. It's not a triviality. It's not, oh yeah, leave all your property and go be impoverished and serve Hashem in the wilderness. You need your private property because you want to use it to serve Hashem. And that's part of the story too. And so in a sense, for the sake of private property, HaKadosh Baruch Hu did the final plague, which is the most devastating, the striking of the firstborn in Mitzrayim. So there's this whole element of, the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim is about economic freedom, and that has been the message of the Torah to the world since the beginning, and even since before the Torah, in a sense, right? I mean, Kilomar, since before Matan Torah, before the giving of the Torah at Sinai, through Avraham and through Midian, perhaps the message has been about economic freedom, and yet we also need the Torah because it's not only about that. You need Shemitah, you need Yovel, you need Peah, you need all these mitzvot that do regulate your behavior and your transactions in the market and your creation and distribution of produce, the maserot, the trumot. And you also need laws that tell you can't kidnap people and sell them as slaves, right? So it's a subtle balance and one that we have to weigh and look at carefully as we try in this new era that began, in the last couple hundred years to build a flourishing Judaically conceived society here in Eretz Yisrael, which B'ezrat Hashem will become, as time goes on, more and more economically free, and also more and more concerned with making sure that we use that freedom to serve Hashem.
Any questions? I wanted to just note that perhaps another way of putting what you were saying, Dr. England, is that Midian represented facilitation of freedom, facilitation of agreements, but to the same degree that they facilitated the agreement, in a sense, facilitated the agreement between men and men and men and God. If you just take the value of that facilitating value unto itself without the Torah, as you were saying, to make it finer and better, then you could end up with a situation where that facilitation of freedom and facilitation of contracting ends up being going in the direction of idolatry, where the transactions are being made with God to God in the singular.
Yeah, I think that element, just to repeat, because I think your audio broke up a little bit. I think if you're saying that one aspect of this commentary is that it's showing how just the same way that Midian could broker a transaction between people and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they can also get involved in brokering transactions between people and false gods. I think that's very much apparent in the way that this ends. Like the capstone on this whole point is this episode with Balak and Bilam and Benot Moav and Benot Midian. And there it's not just about, I don't want to say just about, but it's not about, as in the case with Yosef, human trafficking, which is bad enough, but it's also about trying to take this to a higher level and say, can free markets become level playing fields for the competition of idols? And I think that's a profoundly important point in this day and age, where there's plenty of human trafficking that goes on in the world, which is terrible, but the societies that have robustly functioning markets because they have relatively good and stable legal systems and bases for trust and police and things like that, they on paper and officially at least, and therefore to a significant degree in practice, say that human trafficking is wrong and we should fight it and we should make laws against it. And that remains the case for the most part, with various disturbing exceptions. But if you think about it in terms of the other kind of transaction that you're talking about, which is the one with Benot Binyan, I think this calls very important attention to the fact that free markets, through the role of advertising, let's say, start to become settings in which people can invent this or that new kind of religion or sort of toy idol to try to sell to people, and succeed to a significant degree by doing so. There's a basic and I think naive idea of what advertising is, which is that, oh, it's like I have potatoes and I want people to buy my potatoes, but they don't know I have potatoes, so I just want to put up a piece of paper somewhere that they'll read it saying, I have potatoes, come get them from me and I'll sell them at this price. But that's not all that advertising is, obviously. That's one of the functions of advertising. But once competing economic interests pour huge resources into making better and better and better and more successful advertisements, obviously in some limit, what you're actually selling to someone is this whole story about who you are if you buy this beverage or if you wear these clothes. And before you know it, the people creating advertisements are kind of these imaginative priests who are trying to invent week by week new forms of idolatry for people to participate in. And that is, I think, a fair characterization of a lot of the way the economies of the Western world now function. So that is a thing to watch out for, because according to this episode with Benot Binyan and Benot Moav, Akadosh Baruch Hu is not in favor of facilitation of that kind of a transaction, and it doesn't lead to the right place.
I don't know if you meant it exactly, but what you just said could be seen as an argument that for free markets, for capitalism, but be careful that monopolies don't take over.
Well, so monopolies, I think, is an issue that Torah is also interested in, but I find that in a different place. I would locate that more in Mitzrayim. So the story with Yosef and Paro, and the whole question of what happens when people who are trying to buy low and sell high in the market, which is Yosef, become partners with the government to such a degree that they either, in a sense, grow a business to a size where it becomes the government, if you want to look at it sort of the capitalistic monopolistic problem, or they use government power to control the economy, if you want to give the critique of communism, because I think both of those are there in the text. Those are different kinds of monopolistic behavior that are being critiqued when you look at the downstream consequences of what Yosef does with Paro, because it leads to mass enslavement. I think the level playing field of idolatries, it doesn't have to lead to monopolism, because it can just lead to chaotic polytheism where you have a lot of different fads sweeping through and capturing people's attention that are always, at risk of being overtaken by the new fad once someone understands the moment well enough to know how to design the new quasi-religion that can be purchased for $20 a pop, so to speak, and advertise it with the right images. So I don't think that the problem is fully eliminated if you prevent monopolies. It's sort of it's a perpendicular issue that one also has to watch out for. The question is, and this is very much a question since the modern era in America, and by extension the American influenced world, starting in the 20th century and onward, is when you have more and more people who in their own minds they don't necessarily say they have a God, and they don't necessarily know a priori where they should be finding meaning, and they see themselves as these radically free individuals looking for meaning. Advertising becomes a way of competing to provide that meaning, and to get people to engage in economic activities that combine with their experience of what feels to them like sufficiently satisfying meaning, and that in some limit eventually can become highly dangerous and obviously leads to things that more or less turn into idol worship.
When you were discussing at the beginning of the shiur how Judaism shouldn't be pigeonholed into specific ideology, because Judaism is a mixture of different values, and Judaism is simply Judaism. It's not socialism. It's not thisism, and it's not thatism. It's a uniquely balanced system of a unique system of balancing different values in ways that can't be understood unless one or one can't even begin to understand the balance if one doesn't study the Torah. So as I thought about, I think I heard this in a shiur by Bar-Hayim about the issue of the Shiluach Haken, the sending away of the bird. That there's a concept if a person gets it. I think this is in a Mishnah somewhere, that if a person gets up to daven and they describe Hashem as being merciful, as he's merciful to the birds regarding the issue of sending away the birds, that we remove that person from davening. And I think Rabbi Chaim's explanation of that had to do with the fact that he's trying to pigeonhole, in a sense, Jewish values in a very specific direction, and assume
no pun intended, right? Pigeonhole. we're talking about birds, but yeah, no, I think that's I think that's very interesting. That's but yeah, I think that certainly aligns with what we've been saying, what you're trying to trace back to from the beginning, that we should be very careful not to take a single mitzvah and, after trying to first derive a principle from it, then attributing that principle to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then using, in some ultimate sense, that principle to replace HaKadosh Baruch Hu and say, so since we learned from this mitzvah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu likes being merciful, that therefore the teaching of the Torah is to be merciful, and we should start just thinking of ways of being merciful. And why do we even need the Torah anymore? We should just start coming up with all the different ways we could think of to be merciful and do those. And there are a million versions of false trails towards idolatry that begin with that, saying, let's worship liberty, let's worship love, let's worship peace, let's worship war. And it's all, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is all these things. He's, according to the Torah, Ish Milchama, he's a man of war. But he's also, he has these 13 attributes of his mercy. So he's very merciful. And he is also a judge. He's also Oseh Shalom, right? So there are many things that he is, and we are not permitted or encouraged to replace him with any one of them, because that's the Yichud Hashem that we say, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, right? That there isn't a replacement for that. To insist on his unity is in fact difficult, because all the temptations to replace him with something simpler that is only one aspect.
Thank you very much, Dr. England.
Thank you. It was always a pleasure.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.